I'm Vicky Di Ciacca. I am in my on my third board. I started as a trustee 13 years ago, so about 2011. The reason I became a trustee was because I was looking for something to do as a volunteer. My dad, who was a probation officer, social worker, had always said to me, don't have a social conscience, go after the money. I think it was sort of lessons learned in his professional career. And that's sort of what I did in terms of what I was doing in my day-to-day job. But I came to the realization that I had other skills that I could probably use to help people to use in a voluntary capacity. The very first thing I looked at was volunteering for the Samaritans on the helplines. I went to an open evening for that, but I soon realised that that wasn't for me, that direct contact with service users. But it did whet my appetite for looking for something I could do in a voluntary capacity. So that's when I started to look for trustee roles. My first trustee role was for Edinburgh Women's Aid. So it was a charity working with women and children that were having experience of domestic abuse. And that was such a great learning experience. It was a fairly small charity, but it had a very strong board at that point. And it was great. And I think one of the really interesting things about that board, and was my second board, was it was all women, which I think is quite an unusual position, unless it's a specific women's organisation. It's quite an unusual position to be in. But what that first board gave me was a really good grounding in how boards operate. Some of the things we did maybe didn't work. Some of the things we did worked really well. So that was great. And then my second board was with a small charity, not small, but a very charity that worked in specific areas called Working Right, who are a youth employability charity. And they work with young people who are at risk of just falling through the system. And they work with them to put them in mentored work placements, work experience. Their strapline is everyone remembers their first boss. So it's that first step on the ladder. And it always used to be, it was someone your dad worked with, or it was someone your mum knew. And it was to try and replicate that model for young people who maybe were finding things really tough. And then my latest trustee role is with Citizens Advice Scotland, which is a much bigger charity. Scotland-wide, works with a network of 59 bureaus and is a fundamental part of that network as well. I think because it's a bigger organisation and it's a bigger board, it's very well structured, and the subcommittee structure is really well embedded in the way that the board operates. But so on one hand, it can seem a bit overwhelming because there's just a lot of stuff. But on the other hand, what that's given me as a new trustee there, so I started there in October, is an opportunity to contribute without sort of having to force that at a main board. So I'm on a couple of subcommittees. I'm going to chair one of the committees, and it's enabling me to get much more of an insight into Citizens Advice Scotland, and it's giving me an opportunity to contribute in a smaller group, as opposed to just sort of getting sort of stuck in at the main board. At the main board meetings, there's probably around about 20 people. Not all of them are trustees. Some of the senior leadership team, the executive leadership team, but it's because it's such a big group of people and it's very formal. I'm not used, for example, to sticking my hand up to talk in a board meeting, which is quite different to some of the other boards that I've been involved in. So because the board is so big, those board meetings are so big, it's given me an opportunity to really contribute at the committee level rather than at the board. I think just their vision of a fairer Scotland. I mean, that's just, why wouldn't you be attracted to that sort of statement? So I think first of all that's the big attraction. I was at the point where I was looking for my next trustee role, and I wanted to move to an organisation that was Scotland-wide. So it was a national charity rather than something that was either sort of in pockets all over Scotland or sort of just based in one particular city. So that appealed to me as well. So it was the breadth of reach as well as that sort of overall vision. So I think there's been a lot of HR experience that because I run a small business, and generally The HR side of things, it's fairly straightforward. It's a small company, and we outsource our HR advice, so everything's quite straightforward. But I think the areas that I've developed sort of additional skills in have been those sort of tricky, knotty HR type issues. Where I've been involved in a few of them in the charities, because it's by the time it gets to a trustee, it's quite knotty and difficult to manage. So I've been involved in a few of those. Then the other area where I've developed skills, again, it's in my business, we outsource all our finance. So I have been much more, the experience that I've had looking at spreadsheets in the financial spreadsheets in the charities have made me a bit more robust in challenging sort of some of the finances in my own business as well. So I think those are two key things. I think the other thing as well, and it's that, as I mentioned earlier, it's the complex stakeholder landscape. So I'm used to thinking about stakeholder management. I'm used to looking at the different people involved in when organisations change and the work that we do. But they are really, really complex when it comes to the charities that I've worked with. So that constant thinking about who the stakeholders are, thinking about different stakeholder needs, prioritising them, and thinking about sort of what the key things are that are going to influence the stakeholders that need to be influenced. Be more patient. I think this is the thing that I've found in my role as a trustee, is that things have a natural rhythm and a natural cycle time. So I run my own business, so I'm used to making decisions that things will happen tomorrow or the next day, or at least within the next week. But working as a trustee at that board level, things can take longer just because they take longer. And you may be looking to bring more people along with you. You may be looking to engage a wider group. The stakeholder groups can sometimes be quite complex because of the different agencies that are involved. So I think it's that length of time. But I think one of the things that's a really good rule of thumb is thinking about a board planning horizon. So thinking about sort of the things that you're talking about at the trustee meetings, the board of trustee meetings, is probably a planning horizon of 3 months to 5 years. And 3 months is quite a short planning horizon, so probably generally more 6 months to 5 years. And if you're thinking about that planning horizon, of course, things are going to take longer, because they're bigger decisions, they're more hairy decisions, they're things that are going to have more of an impact. I think the biggest surprise when I first started was the difference that it makes when you've got a management team and a board of trustees that are in sync and thinking alike. So I've worked in sort of there's been a couple of instances where things have been at odds, where the management team maybe have a different view to the board. So, and it's not because we're not aligned in terms of values or in terms of what we think will happen. It's maybe about a different perception of risk, or it may be a different perception of whose responsibility it is. So I think sometimes those tensions have been a bit surprising, and airing them in quite an open way can sometimes cause that bit of friction, a bit of tension. So the very first thing I think that's really important is to look for a role with a charity where you've got values that are aligned. I think that's a key thing, is thinking about alignment of values. It's also about separating out the processes that you use, the skills that you use in your professional life, your day-to-day job, and separating that out from the content of what you do. So thinking about the processes that you use. So, for example, the process that you might use to manage risk. So that's something that's important for all organisations. If you think about having, when you're looking at the risks and thinking about the impact, you're thinking about the probability, you're thinking about the risk treatments, you're thinking about how you might mitigate it or transfer the risk or accept the risk. That process that you would use in your day-to-day and professional life is the same process that you would use sort of in the charity on charity boards as well. But what you can bring to that is a fresh perspective and maybe identify areas to look at. I almost think of as being a board trustee, you're a critical friend. So you're asking the questions of the organisation to really try and help them navigate sort of what can be quite a tricky landscape, and not just now, but within the next 5 years. So I think it's about separating out what you do, the content of it, and pulling out some of those key processes that are going to be transferable, whatever the organisation is. I think it's that critical friend thing. I think it's providing that check and balance. And I think it's about having a diverse group of people on a board, and having there's different experiences, different viewpoints, different perspectives on things, can really bring different ways of decision making, different ways of thinking about strategy, different ways of having those checks and balances in place. As I said, I've served on boards which are all female and have been mixed as well. And I think there's certainly very different dynamics for those sorts of boards. But I think one of the interesting thing about a board that I'm on now and previous board is about having younger people on boards, because it's just a very different perspective. So things like use of social media and use of technology to do things differently. People under 30, digital natives, will have a completely different outlook that those of us that maybe have been around a little bit longer don't think in that way. And it's not because we're not tech savvy. I've worked in IT all my life, but it's just a different way of embedding technology in sort of in how we all live. And there's people that are maybe slightly younger who've grown up with that will have a different way of thinking about it. Depending on the charity, a lot of charities will need to be thinking about different ways of engaging with their service users. So thinking about different channels, different approaches. And so I think having the representation of the service users and the communities that charity is working with in the trustee group, I think, is invaluable.